So good evening and welcome. Thank you for braving the somewhat dodgy forecast for light rain. My name is Michelle McDonald, and I am the director of the Library and Museum at the American Philosophical Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Before we begin the formal presentation, as we do at all public events, it's important that the American Philosophical Society acknowledge, with respect, that it resides in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. We recognize their continued presence and perseverance, despite centuries of land theft, removal, and persecution of their language and cultural traditions. Throughout its history, the Society has benefited from its residence in this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. We honor the Lenape community and those of other Native peoples through our collections, our fellowships, our research awards, and our engagement activities. Now, is anyone joining us for the first time this evening? One intrepid person. Welcome. Welcome to the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the rest of you for returning. The reason I ask is I will go through this next bit slightly more abbreviated. As most of you know, we were founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin with the mission of promoting useful knowledge, and we do this in several ways. We honor and engage leading scholars, like tonight's presenter, scientists and professionals through elected membership and opportunities for intellectual engagement. We serve scholars through a research library of manuscripts and other collections that are recognized internationally for their historic value. And we support research and discovery through grants and fellowships, publications, prizes, exhibitions, and public education. This evening, all of you here and the 61 of you online so far will be hearing from Dr. Brooke Newman about her current book project, The Queen's Silence, The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery, which examines the historical links between the British Crown and slavery from the 16th through the 19th century. More specifically, her scholarship traces the extent to which British monarchs and members of the royal family invested in and defended the transatlantic slave trade in African captives and the expansion of colonial slavery before embracing the anti-slavery ideology during the age of Victoria. Dr. Newman is an associate professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as the 2023-2024 American Philosophical Society NEH Sabbatical Fellow. She is also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and her award-winning book, A Dark Inheritance, Blood, Race, and Sex in Colonial Jamaica, was published by Yale University Press in 2018. She writes frequently about historical topics, both in scholarly and in public outlets like The Guardian, Slate, and The Washington Post. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Newman to the podium.
Thank you. Thanks for that warm introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. Okay, I'm just gonna get my stuff going. In this talk, I'll provide a brief overview of my current book project, which I don't actually need to explain too much because Michelle already has. But what it does is reveal how and to what extent British monarchs and members of the royal family invested in and defended the transatlantic slave trade and colonial slavery for nearly 3 centuries, before they then shifted to publicly embrace anti-slavery during the 19th century, before essentially then erasing this history ever since. But one of the things I'd like to do today is start first with recent events. Making sure my slide is working here. So last April, shortly before the coronation of King Charles, Buckingham Palace made a major announcement. They announced that King Charles supported research into the monarchy's historical ties to slavery, and that he would grant access to the royal archives and the royal collection to scholars. This, at the time, was an unprecedented announcement, and it was made after I and other historians shared archival research with The Guardian, demonstrating these connections, as well as an extensive list of books that they should read, which The Guardian then presented to the palace. It also followed in the wake of several years of controversy involving the British royal family and issues of race, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but I'm going to just briefly mention these things. First, from the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, which led to the statue of Edward Colston, the deputy governor of the Royal African Company, being pulled down in Bristol, as well as calls for slavery reparations. Also, Harry and Meghan's decision to step down as working royals in January 2021, due to allegations they claimed of racism and mistreatment, to Barbados' removal of the British sovereign as head of state in November 2021, and William and Kate's disastrous royal tour in March 2022, which I'm sure they'd prefer me not to discuss at all. With the coronation of a new monarch looming, Buckingham Palace was ready to show that the king took this history seriously, and this is despite centuries of royal silence on the matter. Like anything to do with the royal family, the global media picked up the story about King Charles opening the royal archives and ran with it. Journalists contacted me to ask, how did I feel about the king opening the archives to researchers? I realized then that the media simply did not understand that historians have had access to the royal archives for decades, even if, admittedly, working in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle involves a lot of red tape. But also, and most importantly, historians must work across multiple archives to attempt to even begin to reconstruct these links, the majority of which are not evident in the royal archives anyway. It's also not clear always to journalists or even the members of the public that historical research is typically slow, it's painstaking, it's incomplete, it is full of dead ends, that each researcher builds on the discoveries of generations of previous historians, or that in most cases, our work doesn't require official approval to be undertaken, just the generous assistance and supportive institutions like the APS. Just need to make that plug. As historians know, and as scholars such as Marisa Fuentes, Stephanie Smallwood, Vincent Brown, Michel Rolfe-Truleau, among others, have shown, the archival record related to slavery is fraught, it's fragmentary, and widely dispersed across multiple sites. It is intentionally designed to obscure the histories and experiences of enslaved people. What is captured in the archive of slavery is above all a story of violence, one that reduces individuals to bare commodities. In state papers, in ship's logs, in plantation records, in company meeting minutes, in stock books and colonial office records, in customs receipts, in correspondence, and so much more. And even when that violence is skillfully hidden, like in this idealized pastoral scene of 18th century Jamaica, it is always there, just out of view, waiting to be acknowledged. I'll be delving into aspects of this archival trail now, but I wanted to reiterate the importance of remembering those whose lives were most impacted by this history, even as their stories were deliberately erased. To understand why English monarchs initially began to invest in the transatlantic trade in African captives, beginning in the mid-16th century, it's crucial to start with the geopolitical, economic, and religious context during the Tudor era. By the late 15th century, Spain and Portugal had agreed on paper to divide between themselves lands newly discovered by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere and, quote, not previously possessed by any Christian owner, end quote. Ignoring the presence and sovereignty of indigenous peoples, this arbitrary division was sanctioned by the papacy and repeated papal bulls, which also assigned Spain and Portugal the task of expanding Christian rule across the globe and adding to the wealth and glory of Christendom. The English and the French and others turned a blind eye to exclusive Iberian claims to the extra-European world. But Due to military weakness and fiscal constraints, England was just not in a position to challenge Iberian supremacy outright, especially while Spain was growing rich and powerful off of plundering Central and South America and dispossessing and enslaving indigenous people. Yet, after Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church in 1534, initiating a series of reformations and religious conflicts in England, attempts to defy Iberian Catholic claims to exclusive rights to trade with and colonize the globe from Asia to Africa and the Americas became more common. English merchants and seamen were incentivized by the wealth the Iberian powers had obtained from overseas trade and colonization, and by the supposed need to halt the spread of Spanish cruelty and Catholicism. Tudor governments and the mercantile community understood the vast profit potential of overseas trade and of overseas mining for precious metals. By the reign of the Catholic Mary Tudor at mid-century, English merchant syndicates routinely sponsored trading ventures to a region then known as Guinea, a 2,000-mile stretch of West Africa, today the coastal countries between Senegal and Nigeria, in pursuit of gold, ivory, pepper, and other spices. But these voyages were later prohibited by order of Privy Council following instructions from Mary's husband, Philip II of Spain, that the English must honor Portuguese claims in Guinea. Illicit English voyages to West Africa nonetheless continued, especially after the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558. In the spring of 1561, a Portuguese ambassador arrived at the English court to complain to Elizabeth on behalf of Sebastian, the boy king of Portugal, and his grandmother, the Queen Regent. Elizabeth then assured the Portuguese ambassador that she would advise her subjects not to sail into ports in Africa in which the King of Portugal, quote, hath dominion, obedience, and tribute, end quote. But by this she meant areas under Portuguese sovereignty and effective occupation, not simply claims of prior discovery or pretensions of dominion in regions where they had no physical presence or the submission of African peoples. Queen Elizabeth had received multiple reports that the Portuguese presence in and control over Guinea was nominal at best and non-existent in most areas. With this intel in hand, she promoted multiple ventures to West Africa, loaning vessels from her modest navy to small merchant syndicates in exchange for a share of the proceeds to benefit her cash-strapped government, paid to the treasurer of the navy. It was not until John Hawkins, a Plymouth merchant, returned from a successful transatlantic slaving voyage to Guinea and the Spanish Indies in the fall of 1563 that the Queen directly and knowingly invested in slave trading. Hawkins had captured hundreds of Africans, quote, by force and other means, end quote, as he later claimed, and sold them to Spanish colonists in Hispaniola in exchange for animal hides, ginger, pearls, and sugar, worth a fortune at the time in England. In 1564, Elizabeth sponsored Hawkins by lending him a vessel from her navy, the Jesus of Lubeck. This was a 700-ton lumbering warship. Sailing in the Jesus and flying the royal standard gave Hawkins prestige, and he could claim, and he did, that he acted under the command of the Queen of England. When he returned from this second profitable venture in 1565, after transporting around 400 captives across the Atlantic and selling them into slavery in Spanish America, Hawkins and his sponsors, including the Queen, each received roughly a 60% return on their investment. 2 years later, Hawkins informed Elizabeth that he was ready to command a third transatlantic slaving venture in person, promising her immense profit in gold and jewels if she reinvested in him and in his voyage. This time, the Queen decided to loan him 2 warships, the Jesus and the Minion, which was a vessel of 300 tons. Each would fly the royal standard. Hawkins set out on October 2nd, 1567, this time with 6 ships and 408 men. But the third slaving expedition ended disastrously for Hawkins and for the English, with a loss of half the ships, including the Jesus, and 3/4 of his crew due to a conflict with the Spanish fleet at Veracruz, which was then the principal port of New Spain. Spain refused to let the English trade with its American colonies. Crushing Hawkins' fleet so decidedly served as a message to other Englishmen to stay out. The failure of Hawkins' third slaving venture and its support by the Queen became public knowledge, even though Hawkins tried to keep it quiet for a while, and contributed to festering international tensions between England and Spain. But Hawkins was also celebrated in England as a slave trader and celebrated for his exploits in Spanish waters. He spent the rest of his naval career attempting to get revenge against Spain for his losses, including 20 years later during the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The late Elizabethan period saw an expansion of English piracy and privateering in the Caribbean and attacks on Spanish treasure fleets returning from Europe, as well as failed colonization attempts in North America. English merchants also throughout this period continued to press for access to the West African trade. In May 1588, Elizabeth granted a royal charter to a short-lived consortium of West Country and London merchants known as the Senegal Adventurers. This was essentially a very short-lived expedition and group trying to trade with Guinea. Years later, though, the most significant early company was the Guinea Company, to which James I granted a monopoly over all trade with West Africa in 1618. The Guinea Company's monopoly was renewed by Charles I in 1631, and it trafficked primarily in redwood, which was used for dyes, ivory, hides, wax, spices, and gold. It also conducted a fruitless search for gold mines that nearly bankrupted the company during the 1620s. But by the 1630s and 40s, the English had colonized portions of mainland North America and the Caribbean, and planters were clamoring for laborers. The company at this point tried to reorient itself toward the trade in African captives, but at the time, it faced strong competition, particularly from the Dutch, but also from independent traders. Sustained interest in the transatlantic trade in African captives at the state level didn't occur until the restoration of Charles II in 1660, following the English Civil War and the interregnum. King Charles and his younger brother James, the Duke of York, were intent on pursuing gold and trading opportunities in West Africa and continuing and expanding upon the imperial project launched by Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, which had resulted in the island of Jamaica and in a greatly expanded navy. In 1660, Charles II granted a monopoly charter over African trade to the royal adventurers trading into Africa. And then 3 years later, a revised charter, this time that focused directly on slavery. Growing demand for agricultural laborers in England's Caribbean and Chesapeake plantation colonies meant that there were profits to be made from capturing a share of the transatlantic slave trade and from expanding England's colonial labor force. King Charles, his younger brother James, Duke of York, many other members of the royal family subscribed, some of them large sums. And the king, who had difficulty actually paying his subscription due to a lack of funds, lent the company ships from his royal navy, like his predecessors. He also lent these ships both to use during the ventures, but to protect the convoys as they traveled from England to West Africa, and then from West Africa to the Caribbean islands. The royal adventurers transported thousands of African captives to Barbados and Jamaica in the 1660s through the early 1670s, but ultimately fell into financial ruin due to the Second Anglo-Dutch War, which was fought to a significant extent over the slave trade, and a lack of liquid capital due to unpaid subscriptions, including the king's, and unpaid colonial debts. In 1672, King Charles granted a new charter to a revamped Royal African Company, which from the outset benefited from the Crown's political backing and from its royal connections. James, Duke of York, was the largest shareholder in this company. He attended many of the meetings which were held at his apartments. He was also the governor, And at the time, he was Lord High Admiral, so he was in charge of, in consultation with the king, deciding on the deployment of vessels for the Royal Navy. So there was a lot to be gained by partnering with the Duke of York. The monopoly company was closely associated with and protected by the monarchy, and James' crest was even included on the Royal African Company's official seal, as you can see here, to advertise the company's intimacy with the royal family. Charles II ordered the mint to stamp an elephant under his royal image on coins minted from gold or silver provided by the Royal African Company, initially by the Royal Adventurers. The goal of this was to highlight the coin's African provenance and generate support for the company and for its royal monopoly. Coins featuring the elephant or the elephant and castle provenance mark were minted for many years, including not just gold guineas, as is commonly assumed, but also silver crowns, half crowns, and shillings. And this is just a sample of some of the coins with these stamps from the reigns of Charles II, James II, William and Mary Anne, and George I. The Royal African Company between 1672 and the early 1720s transported around 150,000 African captives to the Americas, primarily to the British Caribbean, encouraging the expansion of slave trading and coerced labor in the English Atlantic Empire generated substantial revenue for the Crown and royal investors and many other investors. Revenue in the form of stock dividends and cash gifts for James, Duke of York, for example. And this is just an example of one of the Royal African Company ledgers. Members of the company received 10% dividends on a number of occasions, but the company had to borrow money to even pay these dividends, so it's sort of interesting to think about in the long run. But the money that they really got from this was chiefly in the form of customs duties on slave-produced colonial products, notably sugar and tobacco, which comprised a third share of the Crown's traditional or ordinary income by the late 1680s. Investing in and supporting the monopoly rights of the Royal African Company and African enslavement in the English Atlantic Empire not only increased royal revenue streams, which they were desperate to do, particularly so that they could then reign without consulting with Parliament, but also it stole market share and therefore wealth from the Dutch and from the French. And it enabled the Stuarts and later their successors to draw a link between crown patronage and naval defense of overseas trade and national prosperity and imperial growth. In the Stuart era and beyond, imperial competition was economic, geopolitical, and in theory religious. It also had a profound social and cultural impact in metropolitan England. Royal sponsorship of African slave trading and slavery shaped material culture and consumption practices at home. The presence of enslaved African attendants, most of whom were children, could be seen at court, in the palaces and homes of the elite, both in the country and in the city, and importanter to signify the wealth and power of their masters and mistresses. Charles II's mistresses commissioned portraits of themselves, featuring young black pages adorned in fine livery and wearing silver or pearl collars around their necks, reminiscent of slave collars, underscoring these women's connection to royal favor by the rarity and value of these attendants. And this is just a few of the examples that I've included. The association between the Crown, England's overseas empire, and the bodies of people of African origin and descent continued after the Glorious Revolution in 1689 and the accession of William and Mary. Although the Royal African Company lost its principal royal benefactor when James II was chased out of the country for his Catholicism and absolutist tendencies, William III agreed to serve as the new governor of the Royal African Company. He was gifted 1,000 pounds of stock in exchange for his patronage, and he's the first royal to be gifted stock rather than having to purchase it himself. William brought enslaved individuals with him to court, continuing the tradition of royalty and prominent persons surrounding themselves with enslaved African attendants. So this image here, the marble bust of an enslaved man, was commissioned by King William III, and until very recently, This bust was on display, public display, in Kensington Palace in a gallery known as the Queen's Gallery. According to the signage under the bust, it reportedly depicts one of the king's, quote, favorite servants, end quote. The bust was removed from public view, however, shortly, and perhaps not coincidentally, after I and David Kahn of The Guardian asked palace staff directly about this bust. We wondered about the life of this enslaved individual, about his identity, but also why this bust was included in a gallery. Oops, trying to get this. No. This is not working. Now I've shown my hand. Okay, I'm trying to zoom in so you can see why it was included in a gallery of so-called home comforts and beautiful treasures. It seemed highly inappropriate. It was soon after removed. The Royal African Company's loss of its royal monopoly over the transatlantic trade in African captives in 1698 by an act of parliament led to an explosion of slave trading by independent traders. And this is really evident in the customs books, which show an increase in shipments to places like Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, but especially to the Chesapeake colonies in mainland North America, which had received far fewer shipments from the Royal African Company because their bases and agents were in places like Jamaica and Barbados primarily. And if you look closer here, you can see that if you look at Virginia on the bottom of the slide, Virginia received shipments of 679 captives from the Royal African Company, but 5,692 from independent traders. So it's not that this trade didn't exist at all before, but now it was legal, and now actually the government and the crown were able to profit off of this trade as it expanded, even as the Royal African Company itself was losing shares and losing value over time. By the reign of Queen Anne in the early 18th century, both the monarchy and the British government envisioned the transatlantic slave trade as a surefire means of servicing the national debt. Slave trading, particularly to the Spanish Americas, was seen as a way to make money and build wealth, and it was something that the public had clamored for. And this is one of the reasons why the Royal African Company's monopoly was not renewed after 1698. In 1713, Anne secured the Asiento contract to deliver 4,800 African captives annually to Spanish America for a 30-year period as part of the negotiations ending the War of the Spanish Succession. Although Britain had its own colonies and its own planters demanding more and more arrivals of captives, access to Spanish American markets was still viewed at the time as a highly lucrative prize and a solution to the Crown's financial problems. Anne transferred the Asiento contract to the newly created South Sea Company, and this company was specifically created with the slave trade to Spanish America in mind, that this would actually entice the public and whoever to invest in this company. Anne, like previous monarchs, offered royal warships to initiate the trade, and she invested personally to a significant extent in the South Sea Company, as did her successors, George I and George II, both of whom also served as governors of the company. Now, while these positions were honorary in a way that James's position was not as governor of the Royal African Company, there is voluminous correspondence that survives of petitions that were sent to the Crown on behalf of the South Sea Company. So they are certainly listening to the concerns of the directors and the board members and trying as much as they can to help and assist these companies and give them patronage. The South Sea Company worked with the Royal African Company, assuming its pre-established commercial networks, its system of forts on the Gold Coast would benefit the Asiento. Slave trading, whether to the English colonies or Spanish America, retained its association with the crown in this period and was viewed as a source of imperial strength and national wealth and pride. And I've included here on the slide the South Sea Company mark, which is what they called it, which we would understand it as a brand that they recommended be put on captives prior to transshipment across the Atlantic and to Spanish America. Most of the captives arrived first in Jamaica before they were then distributed elsewhere, and so they wanted them to have this mark to make it clear that they were part of the South Sea Company. This was a way to track people. It was also a way to ensure return on investment and that the Crown also received its share. So that is really the goal of these brands. How often they were actually used is, I think, open to interpretation, because these are prescriptive orders that are being sent to agents based on the ground, and they're told, this is what you must do. By the mid-18th century, due to a largely unregulated slave trade, which centered at major ports like Liverpool and Bristol, Britain had emerged as the primary importer of African captives to the Americas. At the start of George III's reign in 1760, the fortunes of Britain's growing Atlantic empire had become bound up with slave trading and with colonial slavery. Its wealthiest Atlantic colonies were the Sugar Islands, where the vast majority of the population was enslaved, and where planters relied on a steady arrival of African captives to make up for the shockingly high mortality rates. British victories in the Seven Years' War, which ended in 1763, brought new possessions in North America and in the Caribbean and beyond, and this renewed the demand for coerced labor. So the demand continued to increase over the course of the 18th century. And in fact, British slave trading expanded dramatically over the 18th century and into the 19th century, to such an extent that the British government and George III struggled to conceive of an Atlantic empire, of a British empire, without the African slave trade, without enslaved labor. This was even heightened after the American War of Independence, when the Caribbean slave colonies assumed an even greater importance to Britain, even as Britain was starting to pivot towards the Pacific, towards Asia, towards other parts of the world. When the abolition movement to end the slave trade gained traction, beginning in the late 1780s, the West Indian lobby went on the defensive. They had the wealth, the power, and the connections to back this up. Pro-slavery advocates argued that slave trading and slavery was beneficial to the colonies, beneficial to the national interest, even if it was regrettably problematic in humanitarian terms. And the Crown agreed. During the abolition debates in Parliament at the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, the Duke of Clarence, the third son of George III, the future King William IV, allied with the West Indian lobby and vocally defended the slave trade in the House of Lords. His pro-slavery speech was printed and widely disseminated to the public. And the West Indian lobby, particularly members of the Jamaican contingent and the Jamaica Assembly, wined and dined the Duke. They gave him gifts. They were very happy to have a member of the royal family in their pocket and on their side. Crown opposition, primarily behind the scenes, helped to stall the abolition of the British slave trade for nearly 2 decades. Royal opinions on slavery really didn't start to shift until enslaved people staged rebellions in Barbados in 1816, in Demerara in 1823, and in Jamaica in 1831 and 32. Enslaved resistance and repeated enslaved resistance made it quite clear that Britain could lose its colonies, its sugar colonies, just like France had lost Saint-Domingue. And actually, George III was someone who was on the fence a little bit about getting rid of the slave trade after the Haitian Revolution, because at that moment he started to think maybe the slave trade is actually dangerous. Maybe we need to start winding that down. But never did he waver on slavery, the institution itself. After the 1834 Emancipation Act, which was followed by 4 years of forced apprenticeship, the British government ultimately freed enslaved people, but compensated slave owners for the loss of their human property. And this debt, which was millions of pounds, was not paid off until 2015 by British taxpayers, including modern-day descendants of enslaved people. Formerly enslaved people, however, received nothing then and now. Over the course of Victoria's long reign, the extensive history of Crown involvement in slave trading and in slavery was gradually papered over as the Crown presented itself as an advocate of anti-slavery. And Prince Albert was really the first royal to serve as a mouthpiece of the Crown itself. He delivered the opening speech at the world's first anti-slavery convention, which was held in London in the summer of 1840. And it was then that he made the first royal statement of regret regarding slavery. And this was a statement carefully crafted to accentuate Britain's heroic role in the fight to end the slave trade. And I'm going to read you a bit of the statement, and I think it will sound somewhat familiar. He said, quote, "I deeply regret that the benevolent and persevering exertions of England to abolish that atrocious traffic in human beings, at once the desolation of Africa and the blackest stain upon civilized Europe, have not as yet led to any satisfactory conclusion," end quote. And of course, he's delivering this speech in the context of an international world convention to try to end the slave trade and ultimately slavery, and trying to spotlight England's humanitarian global role. Albert did not apologize or even address, really, Britain's involvement in slavery. And neither the British monarchy nor the British government has ever apologized for slavery or fully acknowledged this history. Since the mid-19th century, Britain and the Crown has repeatedly followed Prince Albert's lead and celebrated its abolitionist roots. And actually, if you think about some of the speeches that have been given by David Cameron, for example, in Jamaica in 2015, by Prince William and former Prince Charles in Rwanda and other places, essentially they have said virtually exactly what Prince Albert said. You know, it's such a shame, not that we were necessarily involved, but that, you know, we haven't really overcome this history and we need to just sort of move on. Queen Elizabeth II went to her grave remaining silent about the Crown's involvement and about the involvement of the British government in the enslavement of millions of people of African descent, despite mounting calls for acknowledgement of this painful history. And of course, the acknowledgement is just the first step in the larger project. It doesn't mean much if it doesn't come with something else beyond that. Unlike the Prime Minister, I believe, the current Prime Minister, the time to confront the history and legacies of slavery is actually long overdue, that it is actually time to, quote, unpick our history, whatever that even means. And I hope my work will contribute to broader calls for reparative justice. Thank you.
I have a quick question about the British attitude towards slavery during like the early slave trades. Do they see African slaves as an equal human being? Do they see it differently? Is there a big movement of anti-slavery trade during the time when it was picking up steam?
Which time period are you talking about?
Like the very early on when...
so you're talking about the Elizabethan and into the Stuart era?
Yeah, when finally
Right.
the British...
So in terms of their attitudes, I mean, as I always tell my students, we have to think about the context. And at the time, this is a context when you have England, which is weak. It's isolated to a certain extent. It is fiscally inferior, militarily inferior to the countries that it sees itself as in competition with on the European continent. And those countries are investing heavily in the transatlantic slave trade. And they're also enslaving indigenous people and dispossessing them, and they are making just insane amounts of money by doing this. And the English are desperately envious to get a piece of this. I think in the Elizabethan period, they're not necessarily setting out specifically because they have any preconceived ideas necessarily about African peoples. It is the fact that this is a pre-existing trade. They've seen the wealth that is being extracted through this trade and from colonization in the Americas, and they want a piece of it. And someone like Hawkins was able to very easily convince Queen Elizabeth that the African people were there for the taking. Now, of course, this wasn't really true. There were people in West Africa who are on the ground who had a significant amount of power, not Europeans. Someone like Hawkins shows up, he's not engaging in treaties, he's just essentially trying to get people by force. I mean, I think that if we think about the evidence, I think it does reveal a lack of empathy for African people. It reveals a sense that, yeah, they are inferior to us because we can just go and take them, just like the Spanish are just going and taking indigenous people in the Americas and enslaving them and enforcing them to work in mines. So there is a sense in this time period, and I think it extends for many centuries, that non-Europeans and non-Christians in particular are not the same. They're not like us, but I do think in terms of, do they see them as fully human? I think that is a really critical question, because Christianity is about conversion, and part of the call is to convert heathen and infidel peoples. And that's actually one of the major justifications for colonization that the Catholics and the Protestants use. So I think it's a question where it really depends on the time period, and the most sort of negative and virulent comments made about people of African origin and descent occur in the context of pushback against the slave trade and pushback against slavery. That is when they really start to articulate more of what we would now see as a racist response to the idea of essentially saying, these are people who are equal to us and we shouldn't be treating them this way. But it's a great question.
You showed the South Sea mark, and I'm curious how that was done on the people that were brought over. Was that a tattoo? Was it a...
They used hot irons.
Wow.
And actually, Stephanie Smallwood has written about this as well, that the humid climate on the Gold Coast in modern-day Ghana, for example, was very humid, and so much of the equipment that they had would break down and would deteriorate, including shackles. So members of the Royal African Company, the agents on the ground, were always writing back saying, we need more shackles, we need more of this. And so one of my main questions that I have about the mark, because I've been really focused on this as I've been working on this book, because it's such a vivid symbol, is how frequently did they brand people? It's something that it's been commonly said for almost a century now. We've been talking about branding, but how much evidence do we have? And I think it probably depended on what they had on hand. So in Cape Castle, which was the headquarters of the Royal African Company, they probably had more of these, the Royal African Company, but also South Sea Company would get enslaved people also from Cape Coast Castle. They would have access to tools that if you were in a smaller fort in a different area, you may not have. So I think it depends on where they were, what they had access to, but it was a hot iron.
Thank you. I think some kind of a filter probably ought to be put into this discussion in the sense that the monarchy was becoming a constitutional monarchy in the 18th century.
Yes.
The last monarch to veto legislation was Queen Anne, so on and so forth. And although it's certainly true that George III was pro-slave trade and so on and so forth, it was actually while he was king that the slave trade was abolished against his sort of will. A little bit, although he was the worst aware for mentally by that point. But 1807 is when the British government enacts that legislation, and in 1815 at Vienna, they persuade the other great powers to also participate, and then they set the Royal Navy out to actually interrupt slave trading, and as I understand, about 150,000 slaves were saved from being transported across the Atlantic. So it does seem to me somehow or other that needs to be factored in.
Well, of course, that is factored in. But one thing I should say about what you just said is that the purpose of my book is to explore how, as the constitutional status of the monarchy changed over the centuries, how did this shape the way members of the royal family and whoever the sitting monarch was, what was their approach to the slave trade, to slavery? How did they benefit sometimes in indirect ways as they lost political power? Someone like George III, he's still playing a pretty significant role to the very end. In fact, his ministers were scared of him, and they talked about how they were afraid to attend any meeting where there might be a discussion with somebody like Wilberforce because George III would frown upon it. And that is one of the clues that we have about what, not only what the king thought, but also the influence that he exerted behind the scenes. And I think the soft power of the monarchy is something that we still don't talk enough about. And it's something even now that someone like Prince Charles, there was a concern before he became king that he was getting involved in various political issues behind the scenes that he shouldn't have been. And Queen Elizabeth would also intervene quietly behind the scenes if Parliament was considering legislation that she thought might impact her negatively, particularly her property holdings and her own wealth. This has happened for centuries. And so I don't think that there is this dramatic moment when you can say everything changed and they didn't benefit at all. In fact, my research shows that after the Glorious Revolution, when the constitutional position of the monarchy changes dramatically and into the 18th century, it's still very, very significantly benefiting from empire, from dispossession, from enslavement, and also from the slave trade, but not in the same way that the Stuarts benefited, because they could do it in very explicit ways. They could just say, I'm sending some ships out now, and there's a paper trail about this, because it wasn't seen as a big deal at the time. They could use that power. But also, ultimately, this is what got James II chased away, was that the Stuarts were trying to exert a level of power that some people were uncomfortable with. And the royal monopoly was one of the examples of that, kind of taking the royal prerogative a bit too far.
Who was it specifically who brought parcels of slaves to the British ships? Presumably the British didn't go into the jungles and capture random Africans.
Right, so they're based at factories, and they are forts on the coast of West Africa, and they are obviously working with people on the ground who are the local agents bringing in enslaved people, and then they are purchasing them on behalf of the company, and then in many cases imprisoning them in a place like Cape Coast in the basement, and then they would wait for the ships to arrive and then be loaded onto the ships.
A question about the attitude of the Puritan Parliament during the interregnum, protectorate. Was there any change in the oversight of the slave trade? Was there a discouragement of them? One would presume with a heightened sense of morality that there was, but is that a presumption I should not make?
Well, so the Puritans were involved in the colonization of New England and in the short-lived Providence Island, and they actually switched very rapidly to slavery and to purchasing enslaved people on Providence Island. And the Puritans were some of the first people to get involved in slavery in American history, really. And so I think a lot of what we think we know about the Puritans is wrong. They did have a very interesting policy, though, on Providence Island, where they would not allow people to to own enslaved people and then bequeath them and inherit them. Instead, they essentially had to rent people, and then if they left the island, they had to sell them to someone else on the island. And this was seen as more humane at the time, rather than having a hereditary enslavement policy.
So British had a reparation system to, you just mentioned that they're still paying off reparations.
Oh.
Is that a template? And then we've talked about, the U.S. has talked about, reparations. Would that be a template for us to follow?
So this was a compensation program where slave owners presented what they claimed was the value of the human property that they owned, and the British government compensated them based on the value and the number of their enslaved laborers. And this was a massive amount of money. The government had to take out a major loan to do this, and it's taken centuries to pay off, as I mentioned. But it's very difficult to take something like that and say, this is a way we should think about reparations. Because reparations, in the way I see it, is it's cumulative at this point, and anyone who's the descendant of an enslaved person should be getting far more than someone who got money from the British government in the 1830s, because there is the compound interest, right, over the centuries. There is the structural underdevelopment of places like Jamaica, Barbados, Leeward Islands, how this has shaped education, housing prospects, medical care, even climate. When you think about it, it's so profound of a task that it's going to require many, many smart people and many people open to really considering the legacies of this to get in a room and be willing to have a conversation. And in the US, this is happening, interestingly, at the local level and in a regional level in some places. But we haven't come anywhere near having a national conversation. And that is very much similar to what's happening in the UK, in that institutions are acknowledging their history, coming out and saying, the Church of England, the University of Glasgow, Lloyd's of London, various institutions. And one of the things that they're doing by doing this is saying, yes, this happened and we need to acknowledge it, but then they're setting the terms for what the reparations should look like. And many people who are involved in the reparations movements, activists who've been involved for many years, are not happy with the way this is developing in the UK in particular, because one of the things that they've argued is that by, yes, acknowledging, that's great, but if you do so, and then you begin a process of reparations that doesn't involve descendants, that doesn't involve the people who were impacted, then again, you're just deciding what should be done. You're deciding what is enough and what is sufficient to make up for this, crime against humanity, and that's just not something that they're interested in. They really want to have a seat at the table.
My question is related to the one the gentleman in the back of the room just asked. When I first was taught about this subject, admittedly many decades ago, the company line was that slavery was ended in Britain due to moral outrage led by some very outspoken ministers. What you're telling us tonight is it was a very different political, preserving the kingdom sort of a decision. Nothing to do, very little to do with the moral aspect of it. Was there any moral aspect coming out of Britain by ministers, religious leaders, and so forth at that time?
So it's a complicated picture, and I think what you're getting at is that there is no simple narrative of this, even of the abolition movement. And when we attach ourselves, and when nations attach themselves to simple narratives, it's because they're easier to tell, they make us feel good, and it's much better to attach ideas about national identity to abolitionists and to humanitarian concerns than it is to peel that back a little bit and get into the weeds. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's sometimes pushback against historians and against history, not because it's not true or because we're making stuff up, it's because we're complicating a narrative that people have associated with their own sense of self, with their own place in the world. And I think that one of the things that's crucial to know about the British abolition movement is that, yes, there were in the 1780s a number of very important ministers, but also many members of the free black community based in London, known as the Sons of Africa. They were working in partnership with the British abolitionists to draw attention to the plight of the enslaved. And people were outraged. The public was moved on an emotional and on a spiritual level. And they were willing to do things like boycott sugar and send hundreds of petitions to Parliament. And ultimately, yes, this did make a huge difference. But if you think about it, it was also about being educated. They were now suddenly educated in understanding what slavery was about, what it meant, and having people like Olaudah Equiano and others on the ground saying, this is what slavery is, this is what it's like to be enslaved, this is what the Middle Passage is like, that mattered, and actually mattered far more than what someone like Thomas Clarkson or William Wilberforce would have said, because what they're saying is based on what they have heard. They're just a mouthpiece that's helping to get the word out and to actually move people to protest. And it's really this larger sea change in public views that ultimately does, I think, help shift the monarchy on this position. Because someone like George III is very pragmatic. He's thinking about empire almost like a chess game. He's not thinking about how is this impacting people's lives, unless it's going to benefit his empire. Because this is a period of geopolitical tension where he's trying the best that he can to retain the empire that he has, to expand it. We're still living in an era when these kinds of concerns often motivate politicians, and it's not until their constituents say, wait, what about X, that sometimes other considerations are taken into account. So, good question.
I must say, your scholarship is really impressive, and
Thanks.
you're a very passionate speaker for it, so thank you. I had thought that, another person had mentioned something about context, but of course, Spain and South America, come on, that's an absolute tragedy that comes up to today.
Right.
It is a nightmare what the Spanish did. And then, of course, there were the French and the Dutch and so on and so forth.
Right.
But this is what was happening, and I see that your focus is Britain. I actually don't know very much about all of this, but it was a much broader approach to power, to wealth that was going on with the countries that had an advantage in power and wealth for whatever reason. And I think it would be interesting if you drew some contrast to what's going on today, because we do have a lot of global issues that may relate to your research. I'm not
That's a big
talking
question.
about reparations. I'm not talking about reparations. I'm talking about what is Russia doing? What is China doing?
Well, I am not an
power.
expert on Russia or China, so I will
power,
just tell you
power.
right now. Right, yes, definitely power. But the point you made about, I was mentioning this to somebody earlier, that one of the questions that I typically get is, okay, well, what about France? What about Spain? What about Portugal? What about all of these other places? And absolutely, yes, they were all involved in colonization. They were profiting. They were making money off of all kinds of things. But as a historian, I can only do so much, and I can focus on my set of sources and on the archives that I'm working on and on the topic that I have selected. And this is a story that I stumbled across writing a book about Jamaica, and really just wondering why I didn't know more about how the British Crown's involvement had changed over time. And I thought, what an interesting book to write, but also for the public to understand. But at the time when I came up with this book project, it really wasn't being discussed. It's really, as I mentioned in the beginning, since 2020 in particular, that there's been an explosion of interest in this topic. And I do think that eventually the Spanish, the French, and all of these other crowns, they're going to have to deal with their own history. But it's going to be some other historians that bring it to them. And I mean, already the Dutch have confronted this more than the British have. And they've done it through the work of historians, which I think is really important, and also through the work of forensic accountants, which I would just love to have on my team. So if any of you know a forensic accountant, please send them my way. On that note, I think we can thank Dr. Newman for her presentation. Thanks.